Tonight on KQED Newsroom, House Democrats are pursuing investigations into Russian interference and President Trump's finances, despite his call to end such probes in his State of the Union speech. We'll check in with the man leading many of those investigations, California Congressman Adam Schiff. Plus, Oakland teachers vote to authorize a strike, what it means for public education in California. And a new exhibit shines a light on a Bay Area disaster that killed hundreds and led to desegregation in the military. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the escalating battle over investigations of President Trump and his associates. On Thursday, President Trump lashed out at House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, who had announced he would launch a broad investigation that goes beyond Russia to examine the president's finances. Mr. Trump said it was presidential harassment. The exchange came just days after the State of the Union speech, where the president warned against, quote, ridiculous partisan investigations. The House Intelligence Committee met this week for the first time in the new Congress and voted to share transcripts from its Russia investigation with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Joining us now is Congressman Adam Schiff. Nice to have you back with us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
We'll talk about the investigation you're heading up in just a moment. But first, I wanted to ask you about the acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee today. What do you make of his answers to questions related to the Russia investigation? Are you satisfied with them?
No, I'm not satisfied because on some of the most important points, he is still refusing to answer. The American people have a right to know whether the acting attorney general, someone who auditioned for that part by saying how he could privately cripple the investigation, is taking any action that would undermine the investigation. He's already publicly talked about the length of the investigation or when it might come to a close, as something he shouldn't be discussing. And there are a lot of unanswered questions about why he was picked for the position and whether he has communicated to anyone on the president's legal defense team, for example, facts of the investigation that would prejudice that investigation.
But he has said he hasn't cut funding to the investigation. He hasn't interfered with the investigation.
Well, he has made certainly those top-line claims, but without being able to determine what conversations he's had and with whom and about what, it's impossible to test those representations. And one thing we have learned the hard way during the Russia investigation is there are a great many times when people, including the president, simply say things that are flatly proven false, without much time elapsing between the statement and the proof. So the Attorney General needs to answer these questions, needs to answer them completely, and not attempt to stonewall the Judiciary Committee in any way.
Moving on now to your panel, the House Intelligence Committee. You announced this week that you are expanding that investigation. What additional areas are you now looking into?
Well, there are a number of areas that we were not able to fully pursue when the Republicans were running the committee. They made the decision really to act as more of a legal defense team for the president than objective investigators. Now, I hope that changes this session. We've invited them back into the investigation, but we will continue to pursue issues involving the conduct and communications between Trump associates and WikiLeaks or Guccifer II, the publishing arms of the Russian military that had hacked these documents. We're going to continue to pursue the facts around that Trump Tower meeting and what the president may have known about the Trump Tower meeting or other efforts to obtain dirt on his opponent from the Russians. We also need to look into the president's business because what we've already seen is deeply alarming, and that is during the campaign, at the time he was denying any business dealings with the Russians, he was attempting to make the most lucrative business deal potentially of his entire career, a grand tower in Moscow, something worth hundreds of millions of dollars to him and to his family. At the same time, the Russians were seeking his help in doing away with sanctions on Russia, something that would make billions for the Russians.
Are you concerned about money laundering? Are you you're basically saying that you want to see if any of the decisions he's making in office is prompted by financial interests. Am I correct?
That's exactly right. And money laundering is one part of that. There have been continual and credible allegations, which we only scratched the surface on previously with the Republican majority. That the president may have been, or his businesses may have been, laundering money for the Russians. There were times when the Trump family, by virtue of their questionable business practices, couldn't get loans from legitimate American banks. And in fact, the only bank that would lend them money was Deutsche Bank, a bank that has a history of laundering Russian money. But there was also a time when even Deutsche Bank apparently wouldn't lend to the Trump organization. And yet they were buying golf courses, spending lots of cash, flipping properties, and all of that has potential hallmarks of money laundering. If this is financial leverage the Russians hold, because if they were on the other end of these transactions, they would know it, then obviously we need to find out.
Other Democratic lawmakers are also pursuing additional lines of inquiry, including trying to obtain the president's tax returns. The president is clearly unhappy about all this. What effect do you think all these probes will have on efforts to reach an agreement on border security before the government runs out of money again on February 15th?
Even before we formally took the majority, there were agreements on what to do on border security between Democrats and Republicans. In the last Congress, we voted to fund border security on a bipartisan basis. The reason we ended up in the shutdown was the president, in agreeing to these deals, incurred the ire of, the Ann Coulters and the Rush Limbaughs of the world. And so he shut down the government for a period of time. Well, that was a disaster for the country. I don't expect that that's going to happen again. But nonetheless, we don't know where we're headed here. I think this committee that's been formed to reach a compromise will, in fact, reach one. But whether that satisfies the president, or maybe more importantly, whether that satisfies Rush Limbaugh, I don't know. And that shouldn't be the standard. I am concerned that the president may declare an emergency, which I think is ultimately would be struck down by the courts. But
what will you do if he declares?
What
will you do if he declares a national emergency?
I think there will be a resolution of disapproval in the Congress, and there are already public reports that Mitch McConnell has privately warned the president that he will lose likely a lot of his members in those votes if he takes this action, which is, I think, antithetical to our democratic system. If in a 10-year debate over immigration and a situation where Congress has considered a president's request but refused it, were to be considered somehow an emergency, we would be in a constant state of emergency. There would be no need for a Congress. So I think it's about the poorest case you could make for an emergency.
I also wanted to ask you about President Trump's nomination of David Bernhardt, a former energy industry lobbyist, to be the Interior Department's next secretary. He would replace Ryan Zinke, who stepped down amid ethics scandals. What would Bernhardt's likely confirmation mean for California?
Well, I think it would be a disaster for California. I think it would be a disaster for people around the country and around the world who care about the environment. This is a president, of course, who campaigned on draining the swamp. And if you look at the Department of Interior, it's hard to find a bigger swamp than at the Department of Interior, where Ryan Zinke, as you point out, was, enmeshed in all kinds of ethical scandals. And now his deputy, who they're seeking to elevate to be the new secretary, is a former lobbyist for the oil and gas industry. He will continue and be in a more powerful position to push for offshore drilling off the shore of California as well as elsewhere, to minimize and dumb down safety standards on drilling, to sell off public lands and open them up to greater mining operations that will pollute the air and pollute the water.
I also wanted to touch on the Green New Deal that was announced this week by liberal Democrats. There is a very sweeping resolution, and one of the most sweeping elements is that it's calling for the U.S. to convert to 100% clean, renewable energy sources by 2030. About 60 Democrats, both in the House and Senate, have signed on to this. Where do you stand on that bill?
Well, I've signed on the bill as well, and I think it makes a powerful statement about where we ought to be moving as a country. To wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and invest dramatically in renewable energy. We are all too aware that we may be approaching, and faster than we originally thought, this tipping point where it may be too late to deal with the problems of climate change. And so there's a real sense of urgency among Democrats that's reflected in this Green New Deal. And you can see the contrast between the parties. In the Green New Deal, which is, a very aggressive effort to move ourselves in the direction of renewable energy, and a GOP, which is ready to confirm an oil and gas lobbyist. So in this area, more than perhaps any other, can you see the difference between the parties?
All right, Congressman Adam Schiff, we thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now to education. This week, Oakland teachers voted overwhelmingly to authorize a strike that could take place later this month. They want a 12% pay raise over 3 years and reduced class sizes. The Oakland Unified School District is facing a potential $60 million budget shortfall next year and is offering a much smaller raise, 5%. Meanwhile, Governor Gavin Newsom has directed the state superintendent of education to look into how charter schools affect the finances of school districts. Joining me now to discuss all of this are Janelle Scott, Associate Professor at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education, and Vanessa Rancaño, KQED Education Reporter. Hello to you both.
Hi there.
Vanessa, you've been covering the Oakland situation. The teachers can go on strike anytime after February 15th if a contract agreement isn't reached by then. Has any progress been made since they took their strike vote early this week?
It really does not sound like it. They're in the final stage of negotiations. It's called fact-finding. Each side presented their case to the fact-finding panel. I'm told that they did try to do some negotiating in that process, but there are no new proposals on the table. So at this point, they're really waiting for a report to come out from the fact-finder. And as you said, then they'll be able to strike if they don't reach an agreement.
So if the teachers walk out, what is the district's plan? What should parents and students know?
Right, they haven't said a whole lot about it, but they are going to try to keep schools open. They say that they'll call in substitutes. Administrators from central office will be on school sites in some cases, and they'll probably hold really big classes in auditoriums, things like that. That's what happened in 2010, last time there was a strike.
Janelle, you were a teacher in Oakland yourself at one point, so you're very familiar with the district. In what ways are Oakland's issues similar to those that we've seen in other teacher strikes around the country, like Los Angeles and last year in West Virginia?
Right. And Oklahoma, right? We're really seeing a growing movement of teachers walking out. I think the movements in West Virginia and Oklahoma are yoked to very traditional bread and butter issues that unions have always been very interested in, so salaries, pensions, benefits, and the like. But they're also yoked to these issues of general support for public education in the state and really looking to increase the supports for counselors and nurses and things that have really been resources that have been decimated from public schools. In Oakland and in most recently Los Angeles, you're seeing those same issues, but you're also hearing very much in the public debate the question of charter schools and how charter schools are playing into the fiscal vitality of these districts.
And so, Vanessa, there are tensions over charter schools, as you say. Can you explain what are charter schools and why are so many public school officials and public school teachers upset about them?
I think she's probably a better person to do that.
So charter schools emerged in our country. The first state law passed in 1991. California's law passed in 1992. And, you know, the ideals behind charter schools have always been somewhat at tension with one another. So on the one hand, reformers hoped that charter schools would provide opportunities for parents to have greater choice and freedom, for teachers to have greater power and over decision-making around curriculum and the structures of their schools.
And how has it worked out?
Well, it's sort of all over the place. There's some wonderful charter schools that have emerged. I think the broad middle is that most of them are just as quality or maybe slightly below traditional public schools, and then another subset are quite worse, right? So they are all over the place if we just look at student achievement on standardized assessments.
And some of the tension is around the fact that these schools are drawing students and resources from traditional public schools, right? So in Oakland, for instance, you can really see a downward trend in district school enrollment and upward trend in charter school enrollment, and they line up pretty clearly. And that's a lot of the complaints that you hear from the union about charter schools.
And that hurts the finances of the public school districts. They get less money if there are fewer pupils. And so is there a movement afoot, Vanessa, in Oakland among the public educators there to try to get California lawmakers to do something about the charter school law?
Very much. On Wednesday, there was a press conference with school leaders, and that's something that they talked about a lot. They have a lobbying effort underway to try to get Governor Newsom to put a moratorium in place on new charter schools and on charter school appeals.
And how likely will that happen, Janelle?
So it's looking more likely that some sort of change will happen than in the recent past. Governor Newsom has asked State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond, to convene a commission to look at the fiscal effects of charters. We're really talking about not just the presence of charter schools in California, but particular districts where there's a deep concentration of charter schools. So Oakland, for example, has the greatest concentration of charter schools in the state.
How many charter schools are in Oakland?
So there are about 34 charter schools in Oakland, and amounts to about 30% of students enrolled in public schools in Oakland. So,
and how does that compare to neighboring school districts?
So Berkeley Unified has one charter school.
Just one?
Just
and 34
one.
in Oakland.
Right.
Why the big gap?
So there are different explanations for the big gap. One explanation from the charter school community in Oakland is that there's great parental demand for options. Another explanation is that there's been deep donor and philanthropic support to grow the charter sector in particular school districts as a sort of proof points for the charter school movement. And so Oakland charter schools have enjoyed significant support from donors, from philanthropists, and from the California Charter Schools Association.
And are there certain guidelines and regulations that charter schools have to abide by in terms of what is their level of accountability? What are the metrics for success?
I mean, I think you're better positioned to talk about that, but that's part of the argument, right? Is in Oakland, for instance, as the district moves to close a number of their schools to shore up their finances, they say they don't have very much control at all over what they do with charter schools, right? There are very few cases in which they can deny a charter school application.
So the law holds that districts evaluate their charter schools every 5 years, and charters can come up for renewal. What we know, not just in California or just in Oakland, but across the country, that it's very rare for a charter school to be closed for underperformance. It does happen, but it's rare.
So it's almost a rubber stamp of approval when these renewals come up.
Yeah, what we do see in terms of charter school closures, that it's much more likely for schools to be closed for fiscal impropriety than lack of student performance on standardized tests.
So Janelle, you talked earlier about Gavin Newsom's call, right, on Tony Thurmond, the superintendent of schools, to convene this panel to examine the growth of charter schools and the impacts they're having statewide. What would you like to see come out of this study?
Well, it would be great if we could establish some consensus, right? I think there's just, the debate is so charged, right? With one side saying, nope, there's no effect on traditional public schools, and if public schools would just improve, we wouldn't have this problem, right? On the other side, there's, deep concern and criticism of the growth of charter schools, and it would be good to have a party that's perceived as somewhat neutral to take a look at the numbers. One of the things that districts have that districts have raised as a concern is that the law does not allow them to deny charter applications on the basis of fiscal impact. So even if the district is aware that opening another charter school will further destabilize its finances, those aren't grounds to deny it. And so this is something that I think the state really does need to take up for districts like Los Angeles and Oakland that are really struggling financially.
And on a broader level, Los Angeles teachers, right, got an agreement last month. As part of that is a resolution calling for a 10-month moratorium. So it does seem like this is part of a broader movement sweeping the nation.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you both, Janelle Scott with UC Berkeley and also Vanessa Roncano with KQED. Nice to have you here.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Now to the 75th anniversary of a Bay Area disaster that changed the nation. In 1944, African-American sailors were loading munitions onto a ship at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on Suisun Bay. The sailors had no safety training and were told the munitions were not live, but it turned out they were. A massive explosion ripped through the pier, killing 320 servicemen. Several weeks later, 50 black sailors refused to load munitions in Vallejo out of concern for their safety. All were found guilty of mutiny, but the episode galvanized a movement to desegregate the Navy and eventually the entire military. Now a new exhibit at the Treasure Island Museum sheds light on the Port Chicago explosion and its impact on the fight for racial justice. Joining me now to discuss all of this are the president of the Treasure Island Museum, Walt Bilofsky, and Mary Wardell Giraduzzi, Chief Diversity Officer at the University of San Francisco. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Mary, you're also the president of the San Francisco Public Library Commission, and you've been working with the Treasure Island Museum on this exhibit. Take us back to that day in July 1944 when the explosion happened. What was the scene like?
Well, the scene was a terrible tragedy in so many ways. You had these very young men that were working in an environment that they were not prepared for, and they suffered the worst type of tragedy that you can ever imagine. And so the survivors of the Port Chicago essentially had said, we are not going to go back. At least 50 of them, that was. And these were ordinary young men. They were between 18, maybe 21, 22 years old.
So young.
So young. They were already in a segregated situation. Over 200 of the individuals that were lost were African-American sailors and other individuals. And so these 50 young black sailors who had everything to lose if they went back. They were afraid for their own safety. They saw their mates with dismembered bodies, were ordered to go back immediately while the white officers were given the proper grievance time off. And somehow or another, they were able to muster the courage and the solidarity to say, we will rather go and face court-martial with the United States Navy, which also meant that they, at that time, they could have been sentenced to death.
So, Walt, take us back to that era. Why were tasks like this, loading live munitions onto a ship, why were those types of tasks assigned primarily to black sailors?
Well, the Navy was segregated, and frankly, it was racist. These sailors had joined the Navy to go fight the enemy, and they were put to work doing manual labor loading these munitions. They were supervised by white officers who were under a lot of time pressure. They pushed the crews to work faster and faster, and then they bet with each other on which crew could load the most ammunition and punished the men if they lost the bet. It was a terrible situation.
And so, Mary, how did this protest by the 50 men eventually influence the Navy and eventually the entire military to desegregate?
Well, this is the story. This is a civil rights story that begins in San Francisco Bay Area that I don't think that people know about. We often think about Atlanta and other parts of the United States where the civil rights was born, but this 50 young men were really the ones that set the early precedents to the modern civil rights movement that we knew. And so essentially the Navy moved forward through this trial and after the trial to be the first branch of the military to begin desegregation. And under President Truman, he ordered thereby all the U.S. armed forces followed. And so essentially these 50 black sailors, ordinary young men facing all loss, gave an extraordinary contribution to racial justice and social justice in the United States, and it happened here.
But did the military desegregate for altruistic reasons in the beginning, or were they, frankly, a little scared of seeing these 50 young black men band together?
Well, the thing is that I'm sure that there was publicity that was going on at the time, and this was a precursor to this modern civil rights movement. But at the same time, the tragedy was so significant. I mean, that's one thing that we cannot deny. It was so horrific. There had never been that type of incident happen on the U.S. soil that I think that even then they knew that there was something that was not right about it.
Yeah, there were two things going on, really. One was the publicity. You know, the NAACP was involved. Thurgood Marshall was a young attorney,
yes.
The counsel for the NAACP. He came out to assist with the trial. And so there was a lot of publicity and a lot of attention afterwards. Yeah. But also, the Navy realized that if they segregated black sailors into black units, they were creating black unity. And they realized that was going to be a problem if they kept doing that.
So they thought by splitting them up and desegregating, that would actually weaken their resolve on a lot of things. And what happened to the sailors who were convicted of mutiny afterwards? How did that affect their lives later on?
Well, they received about 7-year prison sentences, most of them. After the war, those were reduced to about 2 years, and they were returned to service and discharged.
Were they able to find work? Were they able to live normal lives after that?
Not really. I believe they received general discharges, and it was a black mark on their records that followed them for most of their lives. Which is one of the reasons why the Port Chicago story took so long to become well known, because this was something they were ashamed of. Sometimes their families didn't know about it, they didn't want to talk about it. And eventually the families learned. Professor Robert Allen at Berkeley found out about it and wrote a book in the 1990s, and that really helped make it more widely known.
And Mary, of all the men convicted, only one received a pardon from President Bill Clinton. Yes. And some of the men said a pardon implied they were guilty. Instead, they wanted exoneration. They wanted their names cleared. Is there any effort underway to try to get exoneration for them?
You know what? I believe that there is some exoneration efforts that are going on right now. And the things that under the President Obama, there was not a successful exonerations that happened. And so
what is that? Do you know why did that happen?
Do you know the specifics?
I don't really know about that. I know maybe the president was reluctant to push race issues on too many fronts, but there is an organization, the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial, which is working to clear the names of the sailors and working for the families, and exoneration is one of their priorities.
Mary, what's the connection between those 50 men convicted 75 years ago to what you're seeing today?
Well, you know, one of the things is that justice does not happen in a vacuum. The arc of moral justice is really long, and it always bends towards righteousness. And these 50 men were essentially banded together in this act of solidarity. And it's connected directly to what we saw with Rosa Parks, connected directly to what we see today in Black Lives Matter, and even more recently, what we're seeing with Colin Kaepernick. You know, this whole idea of how do you stand up at a time when the society doesn't believe that necessarily what you believe is right. These 50 young men are directly connected to the young people that are here in the Bay Area, that are in Florida, that are all throughout the United States, that are saying this particular issue is not right.
It's certainly a story that still resonates today. Mary Wardell-Giroduzzi and Walt Bulofsky, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
And to learn more about Port Chicago and its impact on the civil rights movement, you can attend a lecture moderated by Mary tomorrow at Treasure Island. Visit treasureislandmuseum.org/Port Chicago to make a free reservation for the talk. Space is limited. And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.